Hello and welcome to Draft Day. This is the second episode of Draft Day, so I'm changing up the intro a little bit because I still have music at some point. I don't know. But anyway, for now, this is the theme music list podcast of Draft Day. This is John Fleming. I'm the first voice on the podcast. Joining me is the second voice on the podcast, Jason Bradshaw. How's it going, Jason?
Oh, I'm doing great, John. I've been, really excited thinking about this one, especially as soon as you brought up the idea to me. This was the first draft that came to my mind, so pretty excited.
Yeah, and obviously we'll get to the drafting here shortly. But, like the first episode we did, I think it was a good draft to do because it was timely, because it was a deep draft. It was a draft that people discuss. This is more of like a one for us kind of draft, and
1,000%.
I'm very excited about that. This is a draft that is near and dear to our hearts. But before we get started with that, want to thank everybody who listened to the first episode. I checked the day that it posted, and it had 0 listens, but I know for a fact that's not true because I listened to it. So bare minimum, there was 1, but I'm just going to work under the assumption that the numbers are inaccurate. We are on Spotify. I think we're on Google Podcasts. It worked for me whenever I did it, but I'm also the person logging it. So, but it is Jason here who is running our social media handle. If you want to,
That's right, guys. We are now on Facebook. We are on X, Twitter, whatever you call it. You can find us on Twitter at Draft Day Pod, as well as if you want to follow John and I as individual social medias. I am at Draft Day Dadshaw on Twitter, and John is at JohnJF125.
That is correct.
But yeah, feel free. Give us a like. If do anything you want. Give us suggestions for drafts that you like to see done. If you want to come on the show and say, "Hey, I'd really like to do this draft with you guys," let us know. On those social medias, you can also email us at draftdaypodcast@gmail.com for any and all inquiries. Or if you have a business product, small business, and you want to pay us money to advertise your product, absolutely hit us up.
Yeah, I mean, that would surprise me as much as anyone, but I'm not going to say no to it.
I mean, absolutely. But hey, you got to shoot for the stars, right, man?
Yeah, maybe we try to get the most deranged possible sponsor. Like, if we got some sponsor that was like a cult or something, that would be like a Scientology advertising these days, or do they have enough name recognition that?
Yeah, I don't know. Or like, can you imagine like a podcast for a thing back in the day and be like, and this podcast sponsored by the good people in Jonestown. Hey, you looking to get away?
Look, we know what it's like in Los Angeles, long commutes, a lot of driving, a lot of time in your car. So when you're driving out to the Spawn Ranch to hang out at the Manson compound, you know where you want to be, and that is in your car listening to Draft Day Podcast. But
I mean, I'm sure, I think we're really big in the Southern California market. A couple of Midwest guys, talking about fairly Midwest-centric draft.
Yeah, especially considering the sport we're about to draft. That's known for being very... Granted, we just did an NFL draft, and I don't think of Southern California as being particularly into the NFL either, but that is that is the St. Louis in me.
Yeah, I'm going to say, they stole an NFL team from us after we allegedly stole one from them. So,
to be fair, they also stole an NFL team from a Southern California city that actually cared about their team.
That's
Shout
fair.
out to San Diego. Shout out to San Diego. We've been to San Diego together. It is a very cool city. I've never been to LA, but I have animosity built up no matter what.
So, I've been to LA, and it's, I don't know, it's too big for me. San Diego was nice, but
yeah. So I've never been to LA. I've been to the other 2 of like the big 3 cities in America. I've been to New York. I've been to Chicago, and I think I really appreciate that. As like, there's a lot of traffic, but you can also get away with not driving, because there's like really robust, public transit. LA doesn't really have that. So the idea of like, so let's put it this way. My wife actually just came back from Los Angeles on Monday. She was visiting her brother / running in a half marathon. And it took her, and she was so, even though both spots were in Los Angeles County, one was so far as drive time away from the other that she had an Airbnb closer to where the race was because that was how long the drive was. Did not seem appealing to me.
Yeah, you know, and I'm
But
not.
if you
Really
are in the Los Angeles area, whether you're in the Manson cult or not, we got podcasts for you.
I mean, it's you want us to come on your, movie or television show if you're at the Hollywood area, whatever. I mean, we're available. We don't have a lot going on if it's not very evident.
Yeah, that is true, and we do have something going on though, and that is discussing a draft that is near and dear to our hearts.
Yes.
As we said before we started recording, I'm wearing a Oklahoma City Thunder t-shirt. I am drinking a Portuguese wine. And therefore, we are, of course, talking about the 2006 National Hockey League draft, because what could fit that vibe better? So, this is a draft that is near and dear to both of our hearts, because, as we referenced last episode, we are St. Louis born and bred. We are fans of the St. Louis sports teams. This was the first time in the history of St. Louis that a St. Louis team earned the number one overall draft pick. The Rams had the number one draft pick 10 years prior, or 9 years prior, but that was they had traded for it. This was the first time that they had earned the number one draft pick, and they selected Erik Johnson.
They sure did. Which,
yeah, okay. So,
and keep in mind, this is bookended around years where the 2 years before, the top picks were Sidney Crosby and Alex Ovechkin, and the year after was Patrick Kane.
And the year before Ovechkin was Marc-Andre Fleury, which you can say what you want about like a goalie being number one overall, but like he's going to the Hall of Fame. Steven Stamkos was the year after Kane. Erik Johnson, I don't think he's going to the Hall of Fame, unfortunately.
Probably not. And to be fair, I think Erik Johnson's career stabilized after he left St. Louis to an extent.
It did.
There was an incident with a golf cart. If you have time, you can look that up. Got injured flipping a golf cart, I believe, is what the
that is the official narrative. Yes,
that's the official narrative. So,
I tend to believe the official narrative because why would they make that up?
Yeah, I think there's things that aren't in the official narrative that were probably. Sure. I'm not going to say anything. I know Eric's a big fan of the podcast, so I really don't want to, speak ill of it. And to be fair, like he wasn't a bad player, and it's not like looking at him, he's not. We're going to draft top 20 again, like we did with the NFL one. I can tell you, he's in my top 20 in this draft.
Yeah, same. He is.
He's not. He's a serviceable NHL player. A few fun or just little things about this draft. There's actually 56 players that have played at least one full NHL season's worth of games in this draft. So that's 82 or more games. So that was pretty interesting to see. I think it was funny. I don't know if you had this feeling. We'll obviously get into it, but like the Saints were kind of like, wow, they had a really good draft when we did the 2017 NFL draft. I feel this way about another team, and it's not a team that I'm particularly fond of.
So I hadn't really thought this out, but looking through my list, there's a certain team that I have fond memories in 2019 of that had a pretty strong draft. I'm not sure if that's who you're looking at, but
and I don't have fond memories of 2020 when we decided to go there, and I ripped my pants in the narrow seats at TD Garden. But
that was in 2019.
I guess it was October, November 2019.
Yeah. Well, I'm obliged to remember that trip because that's the trip that we went on the day after my first date with my now wife. So, the day that we traveled is now burned in my memory.
I mean, that was my last, trip with you all as a childless man. My wife was pregnant with the trip. So
that's true.
That's where we told some of you, or maybe just one person. I can't remember, but
people learned.
Yeah, it was.
So one thing that I found interesting, kind of looking back, obviously to St. Louis of it all with Erik Johnson. So St. Louis has had 2 number 1 draft picks that they've earned through their sucking rather than through trading, and it was Erik Johnson and Sam Bradford, who were both in that tier were like, they're not like Jamarcus Russell. They're not like all-time busts. Boy, are they underwhelming for number one overall picks. And it's just... So the Penguins get the number one overall pick twice, and they get Mario Lemieux and Sidney Crosby. And we get like an adequate defenseman and a quarterback that was very good at throwing the ball like 2 yards downfield.
Yeah, I mean, and it's, it's apropos. I mean, we see it all the time when you have generational talents. Even in this past year's draft, you had the Spurs are another one of those teams in the NBA. They got,
God, they are, yeah.
Wembanyama, Tim Duncan, kind of.
Yeah, there's a very real possibility that of their last 3 number one picks, the worst player the Spurs are going to take is David Robinson, who is like slam dunk, no doubt Hall of Famer.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's kind of crazy. And, even like, but then you have the flip side of it where you have like the Edmonton Oilers who, yes, they got Connor McDavid. But then there's also like Nail Yakupov. And like, I guess, even guys like Nugent Hopkins has been, a steady player and stuff like that. But the NHL, and I don't know if you feel this way, almost maybe even than the other 3 major sports, usually when there's a guy, they turn out to kind of be the guy. I mean, I know recently, Lafreniere's is maybe the one that hasn't panned out here recently, where he was very hyped up, and he's like, and it kind of stinks because like he's going to be a serviceable NHL player for many years, I think, but he's not, the way Bedard has looked so far before injury and things. So
yeah, there aren't a lot of out and out busts. Like people mention like Alexander Daig because of the whole infamous nobody remembers number 2, and then the number 2 pick was Chris Pronger. But like if you look at his career numbers, like he shouldn't have been number 1, but he was not like a terrible NHL player. He just was underwhelming. Like like I mentioned, Jamarcus Russell. There's not a Jamarcus Russell number 1 pick in the NHL draft, unless I'm just totally blanking on somebody.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you have teams that can miss. Like I remember for a long time, I think it was the same draft where there was a lot of discussion of should it be Nathan McKinnon or Seth Jones. I think were the same draft, and by far McKinnon was the choice.
and I feel like most of the people I knew were kind of saying that it should be Jones. And like Jones has been like a solid NHL player. Like if we get to redrafting 2014, I think it was 2014. But
sounds right.
It was, so like he's getting drafted. Like Seth Jones is getting drafted and pretty high, but he's not getting drafted before McKinnon.
Yeah, and you have to remember too. Like when you talk about guys in this draft, even we're saying this many guys had at least 82 games. The average NHL fan is going to know. I don't know, maybe 10 of these guys. I mean, like a lot of these guys are kind of lifelong 3rd, 4th liners kind of players. This
is certainly not as strong of a draft as the 2017 NFL and we did, but there are some really good players, and I would venture to say that while number 1 was like extremely obvious for the last one, I don't think it's as obvious this time.
No,
I think. Honestly, there are 2 players that I've kind of been eyeing, kind of going back and forth on. That's why I was perfectly happy to yield the number 1 pick to you, so I'll let you make that decision. But, and honestly, I'm not even sure they're necessarily like the definitive 2 best players. It's just like 2 different schools of thought I think you can kind of approach, and I'll discuss that once we get to the actual picks. But
yeah, and I think you're right, because I had, 2, maybe even teetering a 3rd that was kind of creeping its way in. And, you look at a lot of these different things, and for anyone that looks at any sort of advanced metrics within hockey, win shares is sort of point shares. Sorry, not win shares. Point shares is sort of the war of hockey, I think, if you want to look at it that way. And the problem is that if you have a goalie who plays any sort of time, like they have very inflated, point share numbers because. Obviously, if you look at things like minutes played, they're obviously playing 60 minutes a game, usually.
Yes.
So that made it a little more difficult and I don't know if you struggle with that with like, okay, how do I balance skater versus goalie, and things like that. So I thought that made it interesting. But and maybe you have 20 skaters. I don't know.
I do not. But I would say that the fundamental difference between like WAR baseball or even like a product value in football or like VORP in basketball is that like with hockey, like the replacement level is just so much higher for a goalie, and that's kind of the way to approach it. Is like goalie, like if you're debating, say you're debating, I'm not sure who the top goalie drafted in this draft was. Let's pull up guys that are on my list. So like I've Jonas Enroth and Nikolai Kumelin, who are like fairly close on. I'm not going to end up drafting either, probably, but they're fairly close in my rankings. But the thing is, like, Enroth's a goalie. If you played without Jonas Enroth, you would be in a lot of trouble. If you played without Nikolai Kulemin, 4 skaters score a goal all the time, which is like kind of a reductive way of putting it. But it's kind of the way that point shares ends up evaluating guys, is that almost every team, a goalie is going to be the most valuable player. And like, I think you can make a case that like Hart voters, like MVP in the NHL, tend to not go with goalies as much as they probably should, but I would say point shares probably goes the top with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we'll see kind of where our... I think this is going to be... I think we might have a little bit more differentiation with this draft than we did last draft, so this could be a fun little experiment, but I will allow you to go ahead and take the first pick. We'll see if Erik Johnson is going to repeat as number 1. He is not, but I will let you do it anyway.
Say, he spoiler alert, he will not. And it's funny, I think, even though I have my rankings here, I think I'm going to go with the guy that I currently have 2 on my rankings and take him first. I've had a change of heart. Kind of a thing, and it's hard because there's a lot about this player that I think you could talk negative down on, in the sense of, I think you already probably know where I'm going. He's had some suspensions.
Actually, before you said the suspensions part, I wasn't sure which route you were going to go, because I think there's things you could say about either of my top 2, but
yeah, that's probably
go ahead
fair.
And start penciling him in now.
But I'm going to go with a guy who, which first of all, I think we both agree, probably steal this draft, taking it number 71 in this draft.
Yes, absolutely. No question.
And it's Brad Marchand, however you want to say his name. Taken by Boston. Boston is the team that we were obviously alluding to. Has a really good draft. You'll hear a few other guys coming up, probably. But I think ultimately, I think he's the top guy by point shares in this class, like 119. But it's the offensive, but also like he's a guy who penalty kills. He's, is he that agitator? Yes. Does he have a great meme of him crying after they lost the 2019 Stanley Cup to the Blues? Like, my wife, who is not a hockey fan, will just like make references to crying Brad Marchand, and it warms my heart a little bit sometimes.
Yeah.
We were married in 2019, so she's a good luck charm. But I mean, we're talking about a guy who, in the NHL, fewer games played too. I guess, some injury history and suspension history. At the time I pulled stats, 996 games played. So, I mean, he's approaching or about right at 1,000. Almost 400 goals, over 900 points. And a plus minus. This is another weird differentiation. I know it doesn't always mean a ton for a forward, but when he's plus 299, I mean, it's, when you compare that to who I had at my number 2, who's also a skater, it's much higher than that, despite maybe having less points and things. But I think his overall game is why I'm going to end up with him as my number 1 pick, despite my personal feelings to the guy. He's a hell of a hockey player.
Yeah. So the thing about Brad Marchand is, I think the best case you can make for him is the all NHL teams at the end of the season. So Brad Marchand has made 2 all NHL second teams, which is the most of anybody in this draft class. But also he's made 2 all NHL first teams, and he's the only player in the draft class who's made any of those. So pretty robust there.
Man, knowing some of the other guys in this draft, that's kind of crazy that he's the only guy to make.
Yeah. Well, I think that number's a little bit inflated because he's a winger as opposed to a lot of the guys who have played center a lot, and center is just generally a deeper position. But
yeah,
and also like most of the guys that we're drafting are either retired or they're like might as well be retired. Like Marchand's still a good player. Like he's not what he was absolute peak, but he's still like pretty solid, like much more so than most of these guys. So there's like some actual room for growth there.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. I mean, like, he's 36 or 37 right now. It's not like he's ancient, but who knows? Maybe he'll Yager it. I think I heard the other day that he's signed on to he owns a team in the Czech Republic or something now, and now he's playing for them to sell tickets in his 50s, which is awesome. But
yeah,
one
of the most fun things you can point out to people is that Jaromir Jagr is not in the Hockey Hall of Fame because it's the Hockey Hall of Fame, not the NHL Hall of Fame. He debuted in the NHL the day before my sister was born. My sister is 33 years old. Like, it is wild.
Yes, and fun fact about that is because he went and played for this team again, his eligibility has once again been pushed back. So he has to start his waiting period over from when he stops playing for them because he just keeps playing. The man won't stop.
He's gonna be the first player to have his Hall of Fame eligibility pushed up because he died, but it's not going to be because he died under tragic circumstances. He's just going to die of natural causes in his 80s, but he'll still be playing in the fifth league in Czech Republic. But
yeah, I mean, and then he'll get in unanimously finally, but
yeah, and deservedly. But Marchand's going to be an interesting Hall of Fame case whenever he comes up because, like you mentioned, he does have definitely a pest kind of reputation. Marchand and another guy who I'm going to end up picking at number 2 were the two guys that I was kind of deliberating over, and I feel like the other guy is the polar opposite when it comes to reputation, how well he's regarded by the hockey men, and the guy I'm picking I think is going to be first ballot Hall of Famer in a way that Marchand's not going to be, and that's honestly more of a criticism of Hall of Fame voters than it is a reflection on the pick. I think,
and no one's ever said Hockey Hall of Fame voters make sense. They're up there with baseball in terms of perplexing how they vote sometimes.
Yeah, they're pretty wild, and also they don't disclose their answers. So sometimes you just kind of see why am I blanking on his name? The guy from Guy Carbonneau getting into the Hall of Fame out of nowhere and being like, huh. So he was a fine third line center or whatever. Probably shouldn't be in the Hall of Fame, but anyway, though, I rant about the Hockey Hall of Fame all night, so I will go ahead to my number 2 pick. So I'm actually gonna once I make this pick, I also kind of want to do the sort of sliding doors of if he'd actually been the number 2 overall pick because it was very much a possibility. Number 2, I'm taking Jonathan Toews. Longtime center for the Chicago Blackhawks, so obviously we as good St. Louisans are not fans of his work, but a guy who for a decent stretch of time had a reputation as being maybe the best player in the NHL that wasn't Sidney Crosby or Alexander Ovechkin. A guy who has won a Selke Award, a guy that's won a Conn Smythe Award, only the one All NHL second team, but I think part of the reason is just a glut of centers that have been part of that process. He's got 1,067 NHL games. He's probably not going to play again. It hasn't been officially confirmed, but he's currently unsigned, I believe, rather than LTIR. But it seems unlikely he's going to play again. At 372 goals, 883 points. I don't think anyone would argue that he wasn't a good player. And I think that his sort of reputation as the captain of those semi-dynastic, I should say, Chicago Blackhawks teams is probably going to be a big part of why he ends up getting into. I'm going to start saying getting Toronto in the same way that people say getting into Cooperstown or getting into Canton. An interesting point, though, with Toews, so he was the number 3 pick rather than the number 2 pick, so not as much of a steal it for Toews, I guess. But the player that was drafted number 2 overall was Jordan Staal, who may come up later, but was a much like a similar style of player to Jonathan Toews, just not as good.
Right.
And Pittsburgh, who drafted him, ended up having to trade him after a few years because he just got expensive and salary cap. You had Crosby and Malkin.
Right.
If Pittsburgh drafts Jonathan Toews, I don't think they're letting I don't think they're trading Jonathan Toews. I think they're probably trading Malkin. And like, who knows how that ends up looking? Because like right around the time, because like the problem with Toews as opposed to Marchand is his peak just wasn't as long.
Yeah.
And like, is because like Pittsburgh at this point, if they don't have Malkin, and they at this point they're just running Crosby out there, they're already not an amazing team, but they're really looking like that window probably closes a lot quicker.
Yeah, and it's Toews is a weird case, and I don't mean in the sense that he's not a good player. Obviously has the reputation, as you alluded to, and stuff. But at the same time, like, if you looked at it and didn't look at names and just look at statistics of even other guys in this draft,
yeah,
he doesn't jump off the page. And keep in mind, I didn't go into the point, obviously, he's a guy who I know penalty kills. He's a guy that I know, very good face-off taker, things of that nature that, don't, factor in if you're just looking at kind of a normal stat line. But he's one of those players that, even as Blues fans, like, we didn't have that much time to like peg him necessarily as like, oh, that's the guy that we want to hate, because the next year Patrick Kane came along, was the flashier player. Maybe later down the line would do some questionable things with cab drivers.
Yes.
But
say what you will about. I mean, Jonathan Toews had his like DWI arrest with Ocean College, but kind of a different level there.
Yeah, I mean, that's
different than what Patrick Kane was getting.
Yeah, that's kids being kids. I think you can, while it's not necessarily excusable, you can maybe in our brains we can chalk that off more. But a guy who, even when you think about it, like, and I just think about this, like, he's never a guy like as a Blues fan, and keep in mind, like, this is like the Heat where we're getting really mad because the Blackhawks, had 3 cups in 5 years with Toews as their captain, I think, and all these things going on. But like, there was never a point where like even one of the top 2-3 guys, like, I feel like Blues fans it was Kane, and you hated like Duncan Keith, and then you had when Brent Seabrook knocked David Backes into next week, we were all like, we hate Brent Seabrook, he's a dirty player, Even
Corey Crawford had a moment of.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not as good as Ed Belfour snapping his stick over the goal as the Blues eliminate the Blackhawks in the playoffs. But I think it's Toews is a guy. He was in that 3, and it's funny, if I actually had to rank him 1, 2, 3, my top 3 guys, I probably have Toews 3rd.
Interesting.
And I know that I have a bias on the guy that I will end up taking next, but yeah, he's a guy who, in almost 100 more games played, has fewer points than like Marchand.
What's interesting is that Marchand and Toews, who were my 1-2, they're ranked 4th and 5th in this draft class in points and forwards.
Yeah.
So obviously, like, it kind of, with Marchand, you're looking at the like all NHL teams, the fact that he's still playing well.
And to be fair, the guy who's number 2, you're looking at a very big reason why he's number 2 is because he has a lot of assists. He'll come up with Ryan.
Yes,
because of a guy that he plays, played on a line with for a long time. Maybe even does he still? He
has. Well, I don't think he plays anymore, right?
He might have retired. I don't know. I'll be honest.
He's hurt. I think he's LTIR still.
So yeah,
I'll look this up.
I'll be honest. To anybody knows, like, had we done this podcast 3-4 years ago, hockey has always kind of been my first love sport that I've really enjoyed. Children take everything good from us that is sports, and I'm not near as into it as I have been in the past. But do you have a a verdict on the status of Nicholas Backstrom for anybody who wondered if
I am looking it up right now. He's still under contract with the Capitals, so he has played in 8 games this season. He had 1 assist and no goals.
That's
Might
good.
be a thing we have to weigh once he gets drafted.
Looks like
could be right now. We'll see. But
it looks like here. Reading articles says likely done for the season with a hip injury. So, in typical old man fashion, has a hip injury. So,
right.
But
you are
anyway
up with number 3.
Yeah, number 3. I don't know. This is a dude whose point machine. We were talking about points. He's the guy who has the most points of anyone in this draft. Really, I think just kind of been like an overlooked player in the sense that he doesn't get talked about necessarily in the breadth of some of these guys. But I'm going to go with the man who was drafted 22nd overall in this draft by the Philadelphia Flyers, and that is Claude Giroux.
He was number 3 on my list.
So yeah, over 1,000 points, 1,044 at the time that I pulled this. And you got to keep in mind too, like a lot of those Philadelphia teams that he was playing on, like through the early and even maybe some of his like prime years, they weren't very good.
Yeah, that is correct.
So it's like I remember, I still do and have gotten back into collecting hockey cards. But one that I actually still have, it's an old, like, cheap score rookie card because I started collecting back in 06 because I wanted to get an Erik Johnson card. And I got a Claude Giroux rookie.
Good for you.
And yes, that's actually in the mail today for a break I entered. I got a base, the cup card of Braden Shen that came in the mail today.
Nice.
For anybody who doesn't know the cup, it is a box of 6 cards that costs roughly $1,000 US. So the base card of a veteran player is not really what you're looking for. But I digress. I could do an entire thing about cards. But Giroux, 344 goals, 700 assists, 1,044 points, 109.5 point shares at the time that I pulled this. So. And it's a guy who, still playing, I believe.
He is.
Just made a move this offseason, I want to say. He's with Ottawa.
This offseason or last offseason? Yeah.
Yeah, he's playing with our good buddy Vlad Tarasenko up in Ottawa. Yeah, it looks like last offseason. You're right. Yeah, but even last year, played all 82 games last year.
Yeah,
he had 79 points last year, 35 goals, 44 assists.
He's not tailed off really at all.
And even this season, he has 42 points in 47 games. For Ottawa, who is trying to think of what the correct term is. Pretty much dumpster fire of a team. Sorry to our big fans in Ottawa, but your team's not very good. But
I think they know. I think they get it.
But Giroux is just one of those guys that, and he stayed with Philadelphia for a long time. I think until just a couple of years ago, he got traded mid-season to Florida and then went to Ottawa. So, like dude did his time. So I'm trying to see if he's
doing his time is the way that I would face playing in Philadelphia for a long stretch of time, specifically for the Flyers.
Yeah, it's
I think this is also a good way to get us some fans in Philadelphia is by picking Claude Giroux because it's kind of a meme at this point, but the idea of like Philly fans trying to claim that he was like the guy competing with Sidney Crosby for best player in the NHL. It's like we'll settle down. He's good. I agree with taking him number 3. He was never as good as Sidney Crosby.
Yeah, in his official rookie year of 08-09, he did finish 19th in Calder voting. So, but also keep in mind, Connor McDavid did not win the Calder.
To be fair, he lost to Panarin, who was a pretty good player too. But
and he also missed a large portion of the year with an injury.
Yeah, also true.
But that is something that Barrett Jackman will have on Connor McDavid forever. Never forget.
That's very true.
This isn't Blues Talk. I will pass it over to John for the number 4 pick. This is where I think it starts to get interesting.
Yeah, so I like that your top 2 picks are 2 guys that are still viable NHL players. And while I picked Jonathan Toews, and now I'm going to pick the corpse of Nicholas Backstrom at number 4. Like you mentioned, the fact that he has 762 assists, which is number 1 in the draft class. Second in points, not too far behind Claude Giroux, but not really any reason to believe that he will ever pass him. Got a lot of those points by playing with Alex Ovechkin, but I do think that there is something to that. I'm not willing to kind of hand wave that because I think Ovechkin obviously is the guy that's going to go down in the annals of history as the superior player. But if Backstrom is Pippen to Ovechkin's Jordan, Scottie Pippen's still Hall of Famer. It's still not too bad.
They were basically kind of what Draisaitl and McDavid have become now. I think Draisaitl maybe a little bit better of a goal scorer than
Yeah, I would agree. But Backstrom was just a very solid sort of presence at center for the Capitals for all these years. He's still with the Capitals, even if he's sort of starting to diminish. Never made an All-NHL team, but did receive Selke votes in 10 different seasons, which I don't think he's necessarily known as this amazing two-way center, but kind of just shows that he had kind of a versatile all-around game. And honestly, if you're playing on the same line as Alexander Ovechkin, there are worse strategies than just passing the puck to the big Russian guy who's so known for one type of goal that he has his own spot on the ice named after him.
Yeah. You put it to him down below the dot over on the left-hand side of the ice. Chances are it's probably going in the net.
Yeah. But Backstrom at 4, and I think he's another guy that a little bit like Toews, where his Hall of Fame case is going to be interesting because he's going to have the hard numbers. I mean, he's got the 1,000 points. He was center for a Stanley Cup winning team. Got kind of all those sort of check marks, but also how much are those assists going to be considered a product of playing with Ovechkin? And my answer to that would be somewhat. It would be naive to pretend that that's not part of the calculus, but at the number 4 overall pick, and Backstrom ended up going number 4 in the actual draft, so good pick, Caps. You did adequately.
Yeah, I'd say they did all right.
All right, you're up.
All right, I'm up, and this is where it can start. Like I said, gets a little bit interesting, but it's funny. I'll take the number 5.
I knew I was setting 5. You up.
You want to talk about hockey cards? The greatest card in the history of hockey cards is the Phil Kessel Day with the Cup, Hot Dog Phil, as it's affectionately called. A man who literally, I think he was on a golf course, just filled up the Stanley Cup with hot dogs on the day he got with the cup, and was eating hot dogs out of it.
Phil Kessel rules. I'm so mad that you got Phil Kessel.
Yeah, but it's especially if you're in. I was about to say if you're an American hockey fan, but also he had years in Toronto. A dude who, I think it says something that in his rookie season, he only finished 11th in color, but he won the Masterson Trophy as a rookie, which is sportsmanship.
That was the perseverance because he had cancer diagnosis, right?
That's right. It's perseverance and sportsmanship. Yeah. He came back from that. First of all, the fact that what's not to love about a guy that if you looked at him, you're not oh, this guy's an elite athlete.
There isn't a funnier thing in hockey than the fact that the all-time consecutive games played leader is a guy that looks like Phil Kessel. It is so good. If anyone's listening, because I'm sure we have people that are not huge hockey fans, if you don't know what Phil Kessel looks like, do a Google image search of this guy. It's not that he doesn't look like he could be an athlete. You just would not assume that he was the most indestructible athlete of them all.
Yeah, it's especially he's playing on these Boston teams, because he's another Boston guy. So once again, like I did with New Orleans, I'm just going to draft all the guys that Boston drafted in this draft. But he's a guy who, as we sit here right now, like I said, Iron Man, 1,286 games played, 992 points, 413 goals, 579 assists. The one knock,
leader in the class in goals.
Yeah, I mean, the one knock that I kind of had on him, if anything, is that defensive liability. I think would be a good way to put Phil Kessel. For a forward, he is minus 155 plus minus at even strength. That's pretty awful for a forward.
Yeah. But so just for some perspective, so I actually had Selke votes as one of the columns in my kind of cheat sheet. So Brad Marchand had received Selke votes 10 seasons. Jonathan Toews received them in 12 seasons. Claude Giroux received them in 7 seasons. Backstrom received them in 10 seasons. Phil Kessel has received Selke votes in as many seasons as we have. So, and spoiler, I've never played in the NHL. So,
while I've played a lot of, if you look at NHL 13, I'm a pretty elite winger. But
I've won the Selke as a video game player before. But it's not quite that.
Yeah, not Phil's game. I mean, a one-dimensional guy, but and like we talked about a lot, like longevity. Like you even said, it's kind of funny, to be the consecutive games played, like kind of guy. But at the same time, it's like, games played in the NHL, like that's a huge stat. Like we're talking about a guy who has 300 more games played than Brad Marchand does in the NHL.
Yeah, and Kessel, I think, hit the ground running a little bit quicker than Marchand. And
he started right out of the draft, 06, 07, played 70 games as a rookie. I mean, and it's just kind of been, consistency. Yes, he's kind of at the tail end. All right, he's done now, I think, right? He's not
currently with the team. I don't believe he's formally retired.
Yeah, because he was, he got a cup last year, right? With
his third cup, I believe.
His third cup with Vegas. So he is what he is. I think his trajectory. He may have had the fortune of just playing with some good to really good teams. Obviously, Boston starting out, and then 5-6 years with Toronto, but then obviously getting on those mid-20-teen Pittsburgh teams is maybe, which is weird. Like he was in the prime of his career, and then go play with Crosby and Malkin.
It was weird because he never really found great chemistry with Crosby, which I think was the idea. Like he played with Malkin for a while. For a while, they were just doing 3 separate lines where you had one of those like offensive dynamos out there at any given time.
Yeah,
which is not a bad way to run things.
No, they obviously, Dan Bilesma and crew made it work. So,
yeah, I'm amazed that we've talked about Phil Kessel this long without bringing up a man Kessel a single time. I'm impressed by that.
I didn't want to necessarily embarrass you, but yes, the funny thing is that, and John and I will talk about this all the time, like compared to like the level of competition they play against, Phil Kessel is not the best hockey player in his family.
Correct. Yeah, Phil Kessel was like a 2-time Olympian for the U.S. It's not like he's
he's not a schmuck, but in the women's game, which I don't know if you've watched any. This is a weird tangent, but the PWHL that they just started, kind of the professional women's league.
I haven't. I saw that there was a story today breaking that St. Louis is trying to host a game for that, even though they don't have a team. And
I think it would be. I think it's cool. I watched like some of the stuff that they did and everything. I think I'm not gonna like. It probably won't be appointment viewing for me or anything, but I think it's good that we're not just going to get these kind of international tournaments. And there's more of a professional thing where we can see it. So
and get to learn the players, so you're not just every 4 years learning who the top women's players.
I'm not sitting there going, all right, is Hillary Knight still around, or are the Lamoureux sisters still playing? Like I'm pretty sure they're retired now, but
Cammy Granato, I'm pretty sure she's still playing, right? Yeah.
The captain of the U.S. Olympic team in Nagano, I believe, Cammy Granato.
I believe she was definitely on the team. I don't remember for sure if she was the captain. That sounds right, but
she was. And then, then her brother longtime coach in the NHL, right?
Tony, yeah.
Tony. So
and player, yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah, if
anyway,
anyone listening does not know what Phil and or Amanda Kessel look like, you need to Google image search these people because, like, look, my wife's downstairs, so I feel comfortable saying this. Amanda Kessel is one of the most beautiful people who's ever lived, and Phil Kessel is seems to have a great personality, and I commend him for that. But
okay. We love you, Phil.
Right, yeah. We do. So I'm up next. So I am going to go to the well of the goaltender, and I am going to draft Semyon Varlamov, who is
my number 6.
Drafted number 20. He was drafted number 23 overall. The stats are a little bit harder. There's as far as like the benchmarks when it comes to goalies, but he was an All NHL second team at one point. He received All NHL votes in 2 different seasons. Even got Hart votes one time. Got Vezina votes a couple times. Just generally a pretty steady goalie, and I think a lot of his career win-loss, which I think we're on the same page that it's not a particularly useful stat when it comes to goalies. Is not it's 278 and 225, but he played for Colorado during some pretty lean years. Played for some Islanders teams that were not the most inspired, but has been a really steady player for quite a while. I think unequivocally the best goalie in this class. And there's kind of this double-edged sword when it comes to drafting a goalie high because there are so many decent goalies out there, but I think he legitimately had a peak of being, if not a superstar, it's like a really good goalie, and so that's why I'm taking him.
Yeah, I mean, guy who, like you said, you always kind of knew who Varlamov was. I believe he represented Russia at least once or twice in the Olympics.
Yeah, I think he was typically the backup to Bobrovsky, but still,
yeah,
Bobrovsky's pretty good. Yeah.
Let's be honest, in his prime especially, he would have been the starting goaltender for Canada at any time probably. That's just a lovely shot that John and I love to talk about how bad Canadian goalies are.
I think he might be the starting goalie if he became a Canadian citizen right now at his age. I think he could be the starting goalie for Canada because not to make light of serious situations, but the pool of Canadian goalies got a little thinner last week. So Carter Hart,
but with him it's. But yeah, I mean, to pivot back to Varlamov, just a guy who, and two, I think by far the most games played, almost had 600 games played in the NHL. I think 599. 599 was his number. 916 save percentage, not great, but top in the class.
Pretty
I think.
Good.
Yeah, I mean it's. I think when you think elite guys, you think the high 9.2s, 9.3 kind of area.
I mean, if there was a truly elite goalie here, I would be thinking about them at number 1, and this was the highest I could possibly justify putting him.
Yeah, and he was far and away the best goalie in this draft.
Yeah,
I think it's interesting that we ended up kind of settling on him at the same spot.
So I had Taves and Marchand switched at the top, but 3, 4, 5, 6, I had the order that we've gone in. So
yeah, and I think it's going to get interesting. I know I've said it gets interesting. What you guys don't understand is the drop off in skaters, especially now, points and everything. We're talking I think between 5 and 6. I don't know. It's cut off of Taves to the next guy. It's over 200 points. That we're talking.
So the guy Taves is at 883. The guy that is 6th in the class is at 660. There is a pronounced drop off.
We're going to start getting into, all right, who's your preference? I feel kind of going forward in the draft. But yeah, Varlamov by far, I think the best goalie, not the first goalie taken in the draft. I think the first goalie taken is probably a guy who I don't know. I don't think made my top 20. I don't know if he made yours. Bernier, I think Bernier was the top goalie taken.
I will say that I have Bernier on my board. He's not super high on it though, so we'll see if he actually gets drafted.
I have at least one, maybe two other goalies ahead of him on my board. But
all right,
we can have that
so
discussion when we get to it.
Take one of them right now, or if you go the skater route.
I'm gonna go skater route. I'll spoil that. Man, I'm going back and forth on this. And since I'm a numbers guy, and even though I think personally I like one of the next player on my board better, I'll take the number 2 pick in the draft next. I'm gonna go Jordan Staal.
Yeah, he was next on mine.
It's like John said, he's the guy, 660 points. But 1,221 games played, so he's another guy who played a lot of games. Only 60 games, less than Phil Kessel. So it's a guy who always played. He's a guy coming in who I think honestly was probably taking number 2, and this is not of any fault of his own, but for his last name to an extent, obviously, brother Erik, his brother Mark, I think would debut next season after he did. And a guy who just later. And stayed. He stayed in Pittsburgh. Finished 3rd in the Calder voting his rookie year. Had 42 points.
Yeah.
Got Selke votes a lot of years.
Yeah. Excellent two-way player. I'm a big fan of that type of player. I mentioned earlier that he's kind of like a poor man's Taves. He's the kind of guy that I wouldn't necessarily want as my number 1 center, but if you get in the middle 6, that's the kind of player that's really appealing because you could credibly put him on a power play or credibly put him on a penalty kill quite easily.
Yeah. Career face-off percentage of 53.5%, which,
Sure, yeah.
If you're a guy taking face-offs and you're above 50%, that's, I think, just about what you can ask for.
That is above average by definition.
Yeah. And it's funny because he actually improved almost year over year. Started out as a guy doing face-off percentage in the low 40s in 07-08, 42%. And this year he's at 57%. So one of those things that comes with age, perhaps. And that's the other thing. Still playing. He's played 49 games for Carolina this year. Not a ton of points or anything, but anytime you can get a guy who's still putting in games at 36 years old, has that many, I don't think you can really complain too much about him. So I'll take and stick with Jordan Staal.
All right, for the number 8 pick, for the second of my picks in a row, I'm going to pick somebody that has a domestic violence arrest in their past, so I don't love that, but going to get a lot of solid years before I get that point. I'm going to take Milan Lucic, who is the 3rd Boston Bruins draftee selected so far. 233 goals, which I believe is 2nd among players who remain on the board. 583 points, or 586 points. Kind of a little bit of a bygone style of player. He is the kind of player that I don't know. He's getting drafted. Not that he was drafted super high. He was drafted 50th, but I think that the consensus around him is a little bit lower in the modern era because he was kind of like a tough guy, you could argue the end of an era, but also the beginning of. Look, we're going to have somebody that's kind of an enforcer, but also has to have some sort of skill. It's not going to be just Tony Twist out there or whatever.
Yeah, but the days of the brawling type guy, it's a bygone thing. And we're talking about a guy too that you really have to look at his career as a whole, because I think if you looked at, which by the way somehow still has even games played this year, despite in Calgary the last few years with all the games he's been playing, advanced statistics
the games
have him as the worst player in the NHL.
The games played also came to a screeching halt when it did, but yeah. So that's kind of I'm it's kind of hard to know how to factor in these guys who are of questionable character. And I think that the way that I end up weighing down is kind of, he got to 1,177 games played, which I think is 3rd in this draft class. Before a lot of that stuff came out. And yeah, I mean, for the number 8 overall pick, I think that with the NHL relative to the last draft we did, which was the NFL, once you get to, like, the late single digits or early teens, you're not necessarily looking, and that's especially going to be true once we do like NBA drafts. Once you get to this point in the draft, you're not necessarily looking for a superstar. If you get a guy that's like a steady skater for you for several years, you're going to be happy with that. And Milovic is just a guy who got all NHL votes 3 different times, which is honestly kind of surprising. That's 3 more than Jordan Staal, but I mean, Stahl's a center, Luch is just a winger. But at number 8, I'll take it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, not a ton else you can say about that guy. Like you said, I think we're going to get to the point in the draft where we're going to have less and less to say about these guys. Because just to be like, correct, here's his stats, he played okay. So
yeah, I mean, there are like plenty of like fine players, but we've gone past the point. We're not going to like suddenly dig up like even like a Phil Kessel level player at this point. There's not somebody that we're missing, I don't think.
Yeah, and so I realize that I'm still just taking all these guys that were drafted high. But my next pick at number 9, I'm going to go with the New York Islanders draft pick, Kyle Okposo. Guy, 1,030 games played. Like, when you look at his stats, and he was honestly the guy that I was going back and forth. I like his game a lot. I was going back and forth with him when I made the Staal pick, to be completely honest with you. And it's, when I at least was looking at this, we had, Jordan Staal with 660 points, Okposo with 608 points, but that was in like 200 less games. So, like, on a per game basis, when this dude was out there, he was producing points more frequently than Jordan Staal.
That's true.
Winger versus center, thing again. Yeah. The one thing I will also say in this draft, not a good D-man class in this draft.
No.
At all. Notice how we haven't taken...
There are defensemen on my board, but it is not like...
Yeah, like I have some further down, but it's... Yeah, there's...
Yeah.
But, again, now, I guess, if you're going to play against this team, if we were drafting for actual things, boy, if I have Okposo on the ice with Phil, I better have some elite defensemen, because he's another defensive liability kind of guy.
Yeah. Which is unusual because like Phil Kessel is like kind of a smaller guy. He's the kind of guy that you would assume is not a very good defensive player. Kind of like Post is like a big guy. You would think that he could at least like have like some value defensively.
Sort of, really. Blocking shots if nothing else, kind of a thing, kind of guy. But but I think for a guy his size, a decently skilled player, with it, not just 239 goals, and they're not all what I call Pat Maroon goals, where he's just parked in front of the net. He's not Keith Tkachuk in it.
First of all, how dare you?
Hey,
disparage the Oakville excellence of Pat Maroon, but
I mean, hey, he's a hometown hero, maybe.
Yeah, Pat Maroon went to high school with me. For anyone who's listening that doesn't get the bit, but go on.
But I think a guy like he was a guy that honestly, like, I became aware of probably way later than I should have, and it was once again just because the Islanders weren't very good. But then they started making the playoffs, and or basically what I knew about the Islanders was I was like, oh, they have that guy that looks like one of our friends named John Tavares. But other than that, I don't think there's a ton to say. But I mean, another guy with over 1,000 games played in the NHL, 600 points. When you get to this point in the draft, I don't think you can go wrong with it. So,
yeah, I'd agree. Number 10 overall pick. I am going to go with a player that I'm pretty sure is not next on your board because you've disparaged the goaltending class, but I'm going to go with him anyway. Might be a little bit of a reach, but I have logic behind it. I'm going to go with Steve Mason. He was the number 69 overall pick by the Columbus Blue Jackets. Kind of player who I think that Mason's reputation is kind of beneath what his actual skill set was because he spent so long like with Philadelphia being kind of just like the guy that seemed imminently replaceable, but he was under enough of a contract that they were going to just sort of keep chugging him out there. He probably diminished the draft stock of your pick, Claude Giroux, just by virtue of that. But a guy that came into the NHL with Columbus and was really good right off the bat, and by point shares, he's a guy who is way up there in this class. He's ahead of Jordan Staal. He's ahead of Milan Lucic. And he was all NHL second team his rookie year, which I had completely forgotten about, but pretty wild. He's received Vezina votes twice. And he's not a player that I think is necessarily, I'm here for a good time, a long time when it comes to Steve Mason. But if you can get a guy, I think that if he had found himself in the right situation, which shockingly Columbus didn't end up being the situation, but if you're like a good NHL team and you have a goalie who can play as well as he did early on at like a league minimum contract, you're gonna be pretty happy with that. So
that is my logic. He's the guy. I remember his rookie year, like everybody kind of being like, "Whoa, who the heck is this dude?" I mean, and keep in mind, what won the Calder as a rookie.
Yeah.
It was in the 08-09 season. He didn't come in right away, but goalies rarely do in the
typically. Even Marc-Andre Fleury, who was a number one pick, mostly was in juniors.
Yeah. And, he was a guy
granted, we're talking about a draft where the number one overall pick did not go to the NHL right away. The University of Minnesota, and we don't need to keep talking about Erik Johnson. He'll eventually come up in this draft. We'll talk about him then. But
yeah. But yeah, a guy. And another fun fact about Steve Mason, we brought up Pat Maroon's Oakville roots. Steve Mason, born in Oakville, Ontario.
He is. That's true.
So
I very much noticed on his Wikipedia page before.
Yeah, it's also crazy to think that, like you said, getting Vezina votes, like like finishing second in the Vezina as a rookie.
Yeah,
and the funny thing is, if this tells you anything about him, like his rookie year and this is, in his almost winning the Vezina, winning a Calder year, like his save percentage was .916, so not elite by any stance, but his goals against was only .229. So which to me, all that says is good night. They weren't allowing shots.
Yeah, the save percentage thing is kind of I'm certainly a believer in save percentage is a more valuable stat than goals against average, but I think that it is a little bit of they kind of work in kind of conjunction. It's not as simple of a binary as save percentage is the end all be all, because Marty Brodeur with Devils didn't have an especially high save percentage also.
Yeah.
That's because it was a defense that if they were giving up anything, they were giving up high danger shots. And yeah, if you're only facing amazing shots, you're probably gonna not save as high of a percentage.
Yeah. And he was, like you said, it was a weird thing I don't know if you pointed this out, but when you said, he received Vezina votes twice, it was his rookie year in 08-09, and then he did again in 13-14. The dude was MIA for 4 or 5 seasons after that, and then went to Philadelphia, became a starter for another 3-4 years. And to be fair, they were in, and they still have been since that point in the ultimate goalie carousel in Philadelphia. We talked about Carter Hart earlier, obviously being part of that, but a guy who went from I thought come 2012-13 he was done in the NHL, played 20 games across the season, and then all of a sudden he's like, oh no, I got this, I figured it back out. I think it was around the time that the Blues also had Chris Mason, so I was like, we got the worst Mason.
Oh, I got confused constantly at that point in time. But that was also I was not, and this, but I didn't really grow up in a household that was super into hockey. Yeah. So it was not it was always distantly behind the Cardinals and the Rams for me, and it was really kind of post college, and granted the Blues got good then, so that helped, but
Well, you know,
like I remember this draft because like number overall pick goes to the Blues. I'm paying attention, but I definitely did not have like a pronounced opinion on it.
Yeah, nah, that's for sure. Speaking of the Blues, that's right. At number 11, I'm doing it. I'm taking the number 1 overall pick. I'm taking Erik Johnson at 11. For the record, Steve Mason was number 11 on my board, so I did not disparage him. But
okay.
At this point,
glad I got him.
Yeah, I mean, but yeah, I'm gonna go with Erik Johnson. I mean, we kid about this draft and would I had rather had most, if not all, of the guys that we've already mentioned ahead of him. Yeah, I
mean, to be clear, part of the problem with the Erik Johnson draft is that numbers 2, 3, 4, 5, and 7 have all gone before number 1 in this redraft. It just happens to be that like all of the other guys they could have conceivably drafted number 1 overall ended up having better careers.
Yeah, it's it's not like all these guys were Marchand where they found him late. So it's one of those where you look at it, but I mean a guy who, as a defenseman, has 63.3 point share over his career. I believe has a cup with Colorado. I believe he was on that cup team. So I mean, good for him. Never a guy like, even when he came out, was playing with the Blues, like never struck me as like this guy is what like Alex Pietrangelo ended up becoming for the Blues and things like that, as like the top guy, if you will. Was never that. And I don't even know how he was really billed. Like, he wasn't billed as a guy who had a big shot, like all that big. He could some offensive upside, but he was like, and maybe the Blues were hoping to catch Barrett Jackman 2.0. I don't know, in terms of just a lockdown defenseman.
Yeah. Which, like, all love and respect to Barrett Jackman, you don't want him with the number 1 overall pick. Like, let's be very clear. So here's a bit of trivia that I just saw. So Erik Johnson was the highest drafted Blues player ever, obviously, because he was their number 1 pick.
Right.
The Rams in St. Louis had 2 number 1 picks, but we'll just say Sam Bradford because he's the number 1 pick they earned. Who was the highest drafted St. Louis Cardinal player ever? Do you know the answer to this?
Baseball or football Cardinal?
The baseball Cardinals. This is a player you've heard of, to be clear. This is not like this guy made the major leagues. He was not like a total bust.
It's not JD Drew, is it?
It is not. It is Braden Looper.
Wow.
So
that's interesting because he didn't debut. Like, he played with. I mean, he eventually came to the Cardinals, but he didn't make it up.
Yeah, he was part of. Yeah, he was part of the Edgar Renteria trade, but that's just kind of what St. Louis has done with number 1 picks. Is they draft guys who like end up having like long enough careers, but they're not guys you think of for being like high level draft picks. And like the analogy I thought of with Erik Johnson, and this is a guy who I think his reputation as a bust is a little bit exaggerated, but Tony Mandarich in the NFL. Like, people think of him as being a bust because he was like this loud, obnoxious guy whenever the Packers took him number 2 overall in 1989, when they could have had Barry Sanders or Deion Sanders. Whoops. But like, he ended up having like a perfectly serviceable, like decent offensive lineman career until injuries ended up catching up with him. So he's not a bust in that, I hate to mention his name again, but Jamarcus Russell way, where it's like a very spectacular and obvious flame out.
Yeah, not an Eric Couch or Tim Couch, not Eric Couch. Eric Crouch.
Okay.
But
yeah, well, I was going to say Eric Crouch, a 4th round pick. I don't think you'd have too high expectations. Yeah, and like Johnson is kind of, because like if Erik Johnson had been the number 11 pick in this draft, like I had him a little bit lower than my board, but I wouldn't be like, oh, he's a huge bust at number 11. I'd be like, well, they got a guy who like had a long career as an NHL defenseman.
Still playing for Buffalo right now. I mean, this year.
Where he is captained by your previous draft pick, Alec Poso.
That is true. I forget that Rock Poso is now there.
Yeah.
And speaking of teams that are not good, the Buffalo Sabres.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean,
it's true.
He's a guy that I think there's multiple factors when you look at his time in St. Louis and how we look back on him. One, because, like you said, he's the number one overall pick. The golf cart thing I alluded to, where he was hurt. And then after that, you have, I mean, if we're being honest, in our lifetime, that kind of 3 years he was with the Blues. Some of the worst Blues teams. Yeah. So, some of the worst Blues teams that we've seen. And obviously it started when they drafted him. But then was eventually dealt. Was that the Chris Stewart trade that he was dealt in?
Yeah, it was Erik Johnson Jay McClement, and that's it.
Jay McClement went, and we got Chris Stewart and Kevin. No, not Kevin. Was Kevin Shattenkirk. So I mean, not a bad trade for the Blues. What they got for him either.
I mean, it worked out for the Blues, but it wasn't like it was some disaster for the Avalanche because like they got.
Yeah, I mean, they got.
I think I would
12 years of the guy.
Yeah, I think I'd rather have like the peak of Shattenkirk than like the Erik Johnson thing was also weird because like they gave him this extension with a no move clause that like they were able to get him to waive it for the expansion draft, which was smart because he was never going to get picked by him. But yeah. So with the number 12 overall pick, I'm actually going to select the number 1 defenseman on my board. Player with fewer games but more points than Erik Johnson. I'm going to go with Jeff Petrie. Petrie was the number 45 overall pick for the Edmonton Oilers. Up until recently, had a real tendency to sign with Canadian teams, which was interesting for a American lad. Now he plays with the Detroit Red Wings, where he has the same uniform number that his dad had, who pitched for the Detroit Tigers, which is a fun fact for anyone who is unfamiliar with that backstory. But yeah, I've Petrie I think is a less not the most spectacular player in the world, but a guy that's received Norris votes twice, a guy that's gotten all NHL votes before, just kind of a like a solid like middle pairing defenseman. And I had him a little bit ahead of Erik Johnson. Erik Johnson was like by far my number 2 defenseman, to be clear. This, like you said, this is not a strong defense draft, but I wanted to grab the other viable one while I could.
Yeah, I mean he's a guy. He was the number 2 defenseman on my board. Just solid guy. I agree. More offensive upside than you obviously get out of a guy like Erik Johnson.
Yeah, and clear. Obviously, going with points for a defenseman is like inherently going to be a little bit misleading because
but I don't think either. I don't think looking at either of these two guys, you're like, oh, one's a way better defender as far as defensemen go. I'd say they're both okay. Yeah, they can make the top 6. That's fine.
Yeah, and like they're both Americans that were both kind of like you could put them on the national team, but like Erik Johnson, I believe, was on the 2010 Olympic team, but I think a lot of that was also reputation. But yeah, I mean, these are both like fine players. These are both guys that are perfectly competent as like late lottery picks.
Yeah. All right. So the next one, take, obviously we're doing this knowing now, a guy who I wish his career didn't have to end as soon as it did in 2020, and that's Brian Little.
Oh, yeah.
Anybody who doesn't know, in 2020, he took an errant shot from, I believe it was Nikolai Ehlers. Hit him kind of in the ear hole. And I wouldn't say watch it. It was pretty horrific in terms of just what had happened. Guy didn't come back. And, everything. So, but a guy who, like I said, he stopped playing in only played 7 games in the 1920 season, but had 843 games played, 217 points, 304 goals, assists, 521 points. So,
yeah, he was kind of a player that I associate him as being like a pretty solid player, but it really like once it was over, it was kind of over. And
yeah,
I mean, the thing is, if your career ends in 2020, but you were drafted in 2006, you're still getting a pretty solid run out of it.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where we see things, but he just, just a too soon thing, and I forgot he did actually puncture his eardrum or like got a concussion from the hit because the way that NHL helmets are, they have the openings in the ear hole. So I think that's where
number 14. Number 14. I am gonna go. I guess I'm just gonna be the one making the runs on the goalies today. Maybe I didn't calibrate quite as much as you did for the.
so
but I'll take James Reimer.
Let's see if you're gonna go Reimer. Okay, yep, that's the next goalie I had.
Yeah, so kind of looking at the numbers, it's a little bit like Steve Mason, but just like slightly worse. Yeah. Basically, like a little higher win percentage, but also didn't play with Columbus, so it's a little bit unfair to him. A little lower save percentage, a little higher goals against. Actually has the second highest point shares among goalies, and let me see where he's at. I think he's 7th in point shares in this draft, which again we only place so much stock into, but it's worth something. He was a guy that I remember Toronto fans, and this is shocking that Toronto fans would start to overrate their own guy, but guys got very excited about. But he was a guy that got all NHL votes, got Hart votes one time, which is wild because he did not receive Vezina votes that year, but. A guy who was the number 99 overall pick, but at number 14, sure, why not?
Yeah, he's a guy who, like I said, he's the next goalie on my board. A little bit down from this, but yeah, we alluded earlier about Steve Mason being in kind of the Philadelphia goalie carousel. He's the guy that they really wanted to be the guy in Toronto, but almost kind of started that carousel. We have everything else. We need a goalie. Who knows? Maybe St. Louis native Joe Wall is the next guy that can really that's what they're hoping, I think. Guy who's drafted a few years ago.
He had a cup of coffee with them last year, didn't he?
Yeah, he's been playing some. I honestly haven't watched this year. I got to look up Joe Wall. See what his stats are, but we'll see if. He's played 15 games this year. Has 8 wins. So, shout out to the dude from Garden Prairie.
Feels like whatever goalie ends up eventually winning a cup for the Maple Leafs, it feels like it should be a Canadian kid, but also that would require Canada to have viable NHL goaltenders, which is a little easier said than. Reimer might be their last viable actual Canadian goalie because they had Freddie Anderson, Jack Campbell. They have Matt Murray now, for better or.
They do have better. Matt Murray. Yeah, they do have Matt Murray.
Which makes me convinced that the Blues could get a shocking haul for Jordan Binnington if they were just like, hey, this guy is from Ontario. He won a Stanley Cup. I think Matthews is unrealistic, but get Mitch Marner for him, probably.
Yeah. That's the other thing you talk about. It's like their best player is also an American. So
it rules. I just mentioned Jeff Petrie, but whenever Patrick was one of the best players on the Canadiens, the Jets have Connor Hellebuck and going back a little bit more, Dustin Byfuglien. It's so great.
Oh yeah, even Brian Little is American, I believe, as well, right?
I believe he's Canadian.
Is he Canadian? What about
Quinn Hughes is American. He's on the Canadian team.
He sure is. Quinn Hughes, man. How about those three? Talk about NHL families. Both of them earlier.
Well, both of the Tkachuks.
Yeah, both the Tkachuks. Good St. Louis boys. It's it's an interesting thing because you think back to the Canadians when they were dominating. It was if you were French Canadian, you played for the Canadians, and yet we had David Perron 74 times on the Blues. So,
well, the Canadians in that era barely had non Quebec Canadians. It was Ken Dryden were really kind of pushing the envelope by having a guy from Ontario or wherever it is. Like,
for a dude who like barely played in the regular season as a rookie, though, to come in and get him a cup in the playoffs. I guess they accepted him, but yeah.
Like Larry Robinson had to be a first ballot Hall of Famer to accept a guy from like the Toronto area. All right, you are up at number 15, I believe it is.
15. All right. Oh man. I'm gonna go with Nick Foligno.
Yeah, that is the right pick.
I guess I just have to stick with guys who have had like really gruesome injuries, only as opposed to ending his career. Nick Foligno actually came back and like won the game for his team in a game in which he had to like go back and get a ton of stitches, I believe it was, after getting like decked in the face with a puck. A guy who, drafted by Ottawa, but really, kind of became the guy for a while in Columbus, kind of their middling teams.
Yeah, like he was kind of like the closest thing to a star player that some of those like post Rick Nash.
Yeah,
I guess they had Bobrovsky, like star forward, I guess.
Skater, yeah. I mean, after they got rid of the greatest player of all time, Sergei Fedorov. Which fun piece of trivia, as of right now, the only NHL Hall of Famer to play for the Columbus Blue Jackets.
I think you're joking about the Fedorov being the greatest player of all time, but I'm not saying it either.
John
knows, really good.
He was like, and this is bad as a Blues fan growing up. The Red Wings just owned the Blues in the 90s when I was growing up. And I found a book in my library in like middle school about Sergei Fedorov and just became obsessed with him. So
I think every kid of our generation has the story of like the kid they read like a kid's biography of and were like, oh, this guy's awesome. Ironically, mine was Bobby Bonilla, and then he became this huge meme for his Mets contract, and that was like
$1 million a year, baby. It's yeah.
I have a very long, very boring rant about how that contract's not such a bad deal for the Mets, but I'll spare everybody of that right now.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we'll do the Bobby Bonilla draft. But yeah, fun things about Nick Foligno in the 2016-17 season, he won the King Clancy Memorial and Mark Messier Leadership Awards. So that's
the Mark Messier Leadership, the most important award of them all.
Yeah. I mean, King Clancy is also, I think, like another leadership type award thing. So,
I get some of them confused. Honestly, the NHL has so many awards, and like half of them are just like, "This is a good guy" kind of awards.
Yeah, I mean, the Lady Bing or whatever. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I have
columns. I have columns on my Excel sheet about like awards. One, I did not bother with the Lady Bing, nor. I mean, granted, the Lady Bing winner is usually a pretty good player, but usually not. It's like a combination of points and not getting penalty minutes, pretty much.
Yeah. It's basically who's the least penalized good player.
It's like for some reason the best sportsmanship doesn't ever go to like a goalie. I'm not really sure why that is exactly, but
yeah, I don't know. Patrick Waugh ruined it for everybody. I don't know.
You're like Ron Hextall or somebody, yeah.
But yeah, Foligno is still playing for our favorite team this year, the Chicago Dumpster Fires, or the Fighting Bedards. Played 44 games this year, so over 1,100 in his career, 544 points.
Yeah,
so
he seems like a pretty well-regarded player too. I think that Chicago kind of tried getting those like veteran presence kind of guys for Bedard. Obviously, like with Corey Perry, it doesn't always work out exactly the way they probably were planning. But when it comes to Foligno, I think they extended him too, didn't they?
I think so.
That's wild.
And keeping with the the theme too with Foligno, brother who has also been a player in the NHL, Marcus Foligno, and yours of Minnesota and some other teams. So if you go goalie here, John, I'm gonna lose it.
I am not gonna go. I am not gonna go goalie here, which isn't to say that I'm not gonna go goalie eventually, but for right now, I'm not going to. Number 16, I'm going to draft the player that was the number 6 overall pick. So I think somebody that slid down a little bit. I'm going to go with Derek Brassard, Columbus draft pick. Just reference Columbus with Nick Foligno, but Brassard is a player that has over 1,000 NHL games, which doesn't seem right, but has been a serviceable, like, little over a point every 2 games kind of forward. Not a major award type of guy. Nothing as far as like, weird heart votes or anything like that, but a guy that was apparently good enough to get traded for Mika Zibanejad, so speaks well to him. But yeah, I mean, at this point in the draft, if we're talking like, the number 16 overall pick is going to a playoff team at this point in time. So if I'm going with a guy that's like a viable NHL player that I trust to but playing over 1,000 games, that seems like a reasonable use of the pick. So that is where I will go. I mean, should they have? I mean, looking at the guys they could have had like right after him, like I posted him a little bit better, but I don't think that he's quite in like bust level territory. Brassard is kind of a number 6. You're gonna just kind of be like, that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, he's a guy who, not the flashiest in terms of center play, but like a lot of these guys in their longevity and service, serviceable NHL player. The games played all count the same if you're on the first line or the fourth line. And I think especially even guys in this draft, we've seen it become, it's not the game of the 80s and 90s where 2 lines can essentially kind of carry you, or even one really, really good line. Don't get me wrong, those lines help as Pittsburgh and other teams throughout the 2000s. And Chicago showed us, but you have to be able to roll 4 line.
As my guy Nick Backstrom might attest, you can kind of get by on a very strong line, but you are up at number 7.
Only one cup though. Only one cup.
That's true. You're up at number 17, and I'm curious. I have an idea of where you're going, but I'm not 100% sure. So let's hear it.
I'm gonna go goalie, John. I'm gonna go goalie here.
Oof.
And I'm gonna go with the Czech, Michael Neuwirth.
Michael Neuwirth, all right.
My next pick. Guy, only 257 games played in the NHL. He was another one of those like flash in the pan. He had a little bit of a run there where it's like, hey, this guy might be a serviceable NHL goalie, and then he wasn't. 105 and 93. 910 save percentage, 271 goals against.
Yeah.
He's not, Bernier is a guy that, I would imagine you probably have him above Neuwirth in terms of goalies on your list. Of a lot more games played and such, but I don't know. Neuwirth's the kind of guy that I wonder if he had been in a different situation. Because keep in mind, also drafted by the Capitals in this draft. So like him and Varlamov were taking like 12 picks apart by the same team.
Yeah. And I think Neuwirth, and like you alluded to, I had Bernier higher than I had Neuwirth, but I think Neuwirth has like the higher like upside. Like he's had the kind of higher peak.
Yeah, I think he's a guy that, and this is maybe me going away a little bit from maybe the idea of this going best player kind of thing, but he's a guy that I think if he was in a different situation from draft time, and then when he did start to get play, it was in one of those kind of goalie carousels where they were, they had the Shepherds hook quick to pull guys, and because I think goalie's one of those weird positions. Like, why do you think Jordan Binnington was so successful in 2019 as a rookie? Because he was, he wasn't a 22-year-old rookie playing in the NHL.
Yeah, for sure.
It's one of those things that comes with time. And you look at, a guy like Dominik Hasek with the Blackhawks was an extremely mediocre goalie and then goes to Buffalo and becomes like the greatest goalie ever, or, at least in terms of run, obviously I don't think he's probably the greatest goalie of all time, but he's not in that conversation. So but I think in today's culture and the way it goes and the way that coaches get fired quickly and stuff, I think, he's a guy that if he had been drafted in 1996, not 2006, could have been a different situation. I think his ceiling higher, even he just went to a different situation because he just started to bounce around a lot and didn't get a ton of chances. So,
yeah, sure.
As much as I wanted to take journeyman Chad Johnson, who is in this draft, who I don't think is going to make any of our boards, but we have to give a shout out. Yeah, but
I mean, he's on my long list. He's not in my top 20. I'm going to go ahead. I'll take Bernier, Jonathan Bernier. I think if I have to think of two goalies that do not inspire any excitement in me whatsoever, but I'm like, yeah, whatever, they're fine. James Reimer, Jonathan Bernier are probably my top two picks, so I don't really have a whole lot to say about this one. He's just next to my board. Player who has had a long, played in 404 NHL games, which is quite a bit more than Neuwirth, below the other goalies, which I also drafted. 912 save percentage is fine. Barely a winning record, but hey, it's still a winning record. Win shares like him, relatively speaking. He's like by far number one among guys who are still left on the board. That's as much passion as I can work up about Jonathan Bernier. I firmly believe it's the right pick, but also I am not interested in it at all. So you can go up next.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. All right, so I'm on to my last pick here. And if you don't know where I'm going with this pick, John,
you have to do it. You have to do it.
So I'll obviously get into a story. I am taking my second first-round St. Louis Blues pick here. I'm going to go with the Swede Patrick Berglund. Now, for anybody who needs to know, and John can attest, this wasn't me just being trying to be this is legitimately my favorite player since he came onto the Blues. He was my favorite player. At my first wedding's rehearsal dinner, I wore a Patrick Berglund jersey.
That's true.
This is a guy, and to be fair, this isn't just a ludicrous pick in terms of who's left in the draft.
He wasn't next to me. I think he was third on my. Actually, second.
And to be fair, I have two guys that are still left on my board that are ahead of him, but I knew I was taking him no matter what. Yeah, I put him 20 on my board, and that was just going to be he's getting taken with my last pick.
Yep. He was 20 on my board as well.
So I mean, he's a guy. I mean, he had 717 games in the NHL, 326 points. I actually went on Twitter, was looking at one of our friends' things, and his banner picture is still Patrick Berglund whiffing and face planting on a shot, which just brings a little smile to my face. Really a sad way that he kind of left the NHL. I don't know how familiar you are with it, John. He was a guy who was traded to Buffalo. I believe that was in the deal. Was that the Sabotka deal, I think?
For Ryan O'Reilly, yeah.
Yeah, and Ryan O'Reilly, yeah. And really,
we've avoided saying Tage Thompson and all that.
And yeah, I don't.
We got a cup. It's fine, but Tage Thompson turned out a lot.
Tage Thompson, we gave up on Tuesday, but Berglund, and it stinks though because in Buffalo, if you say this guy's name, he's pretty much hated because essentially being traded from St. Louis kind of just, if you aren't familiar, it crushed the guy's spirit. And he just is I don't want to play anymore. I wanted to play in St. Louis. The fact that they got rid of me makes me feel like I'm no good. And I think he's kind of bounced back. Maybe played some in Sweden after he went back home and stuff. But, and the other thing too, it's seeing him play, he was one of those guys that whenever they, I was, to show my age, when this draft happened, I was 16 years old. So, I would watch and get on and watch the things the Blues are doing that were fun or whatever with the players and stuff, and he was always one of the guys that was kind of having fun, real kind of jovial guy. So that's why I gravitated to him. A serviceable player. He was kind of in that young core. He came up around the same time. It was TJ Oshie, David Perron. I think they were kind of the big three that came in this era with the Blues, the young three. I think they maybe all debuted the same year. despite being drafted in different years. But the guy who never really fully panned out, but he was always going to be the pick. Like I said, there are two guys on my board ahead of him. I won't say who they are in case one of them's your last pick, but I got to give a shout out to Patrick Berglund. I still have the jersey.
Yeah.
It doesn't fit me anymore because I've gained weight in the last 20 years, or not 20, 10 years, 12 years.
20 years.
I don't know, man. It's once you have kids, like all time goes out the window. But shout out Patrick if you're listening. We'd love to have you on. Talk to you sometime.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, John.
Perfectly reasonable.
Close us out.
There's a lot of guys that I have some levels of affection for that are still on the board. Matthew Perot's a solid player. Chris Stewart, obviously a player who was cushions as well and was a first round pick. But I'm gonna go with a guy that, despite mostly associating him with the Blackhawks, I've always thought was a solid bottom six kind of guy. Artem Simov, just as the number 20 pick, a guy that's a really solid bottom six checking line kind of player. 771 career games. Not an enormous point scorer, but got 180 goals in his career, which looking at the list, is number one of the guys that are left in the draft, and kind of a guy that, and it probably is a little bit of Blackhawk. It's weird because I obviously did not root for the Chicago Blackhawks during his time, but a lot of those guys kind of have sort of the winner kind of feeling towards them, even beyond guys like Jonathan Taves. In the way that I'm Johnny Oduya is just clearly a winner because he played for those teams, and that's a little bit of what it is with Anisimov, but also I think you look at the numbers, they're defensible for a guy being drafted in this spot. And looking at the guys that we drafted, every player that we drafted, I believe, was the lowest player drafted was James Reimer, who was number 99. So a fairly I think Marchand was the second lowest player drafted at 71. So
yeah,
this was not an out there draft. Guys were directional picked in around the right spots. And I was looking at the list earlier today, and the top guy that didn't make the NHL was late teens, which is pretty good. Yeah,
I mean we're talking the lowest drafted guy to play at least 80 games is. I was would I have heard of him? Because there's some of these guys on here. I'm they've played over 80 games in the NHL. I know. But Eric Condra, the lowest drafted guy to have at least 80, 372 games played, drafted 211th overall by Ottawa. So good for him.
Oh.
Some other really interesting things. People in this draft, got to give a shout out to one of the best names in hockey, and Cal Clutterbuck.
He was on my. He wasn't in my top 20, but he was on my kind of long list. Perot is actually the only player in my top 20 that didn't get drafted at all. So actually ended up being about right.
Yeah, I mean, then you have. I mean, even just like you said, Chris Stewart, Michael Frolik. Michael Grabner.
And these are solid players, yeah.
Yeah. Nikolai Kulemin, Leo Komarov. Even guys like Mike Weber, Eric Gryba, guys that are a little further down in terms of point shares. And shout out to a guy that I've never heard of, in John McCarthy, for being the only player with at least 82 games played who has a negative point share.
That was so when it comes to wins above replacement, you get guys fairly often who have negative. It's a minority of players, but it happens enough. But if you have point shares or win shares in the NBA and you're negative, that is a sign that did not go well for you.
Yeah, and the NHL is pretty much in line with that. And this is a guy who in 88 games had 3 goals and 3 assists.
Was he a goalie?
He was a left winger.
Oh dear God! Oh my God! That's Oh boy, I can see how he was negative. That makes
Yeah, I
sense.
mean, shout out to you, John. But yeah, I mean that's interesting. And there's a guy who's 0, but yeah, I mean in terms of at least how I understand it, like point shares, deals with how they determine standings within the NHL and what you contribute to that. So to actively take away points from your team when you get 0 points for a loss, keep in mind.
I'm basically just imagining guys like turning around and shooting it on their own net, like basically imagining like in like NASCAR video games where, and I think anyone's ever played a NASCAR video game has at some point turned their car around and backwards just to cause
Or
chaos.
Mario Kart. I mean,
Yeah.
yes, maybe not quite the accidents you could cause in a NASCAR video.
Yeah, I remember doing that. I remember doing that, and this is way off topic, but I remember doing that as a kid, and it was like a NASCAR '99, I think it was, and then once I realized that like multiple of the drivers in that game had died in auto wrecks, Dale Earnhardt obviously, but like Kenny Irwin Jr. is like, I don't know if he'll necessarily great intentionally wrecking these guys, but
yeah, don't do that, kids. Play the games the way they're intended to be played.
I feel worse about like what I've done in NASCAR video games than in like all the Grand Theft Auto games I've combined, which I'm not sure what exactly that says about me, but maybe it's the specificity.
Yeah, I don't know. I got nothing there. I don't know.
All right, well, I'm gonna go ahead and just kind of commiserate my own levels of guilt, but before we call it a night, I think we should recap our drafts. I actually remembered to take notes this time, so
I did too, just in case you got off. So,
all right, so Jason's picks were Brad Marchand, Claude Giroux, Phil Kessel, Jordan Stahl, Kyle Okposo, Erik Johnson, Brian Little, Nick Foligno. Is it Michael? I'm never sure on Neuvirth's first name.
I believe it's Michael.
Michael Neuvirth and Patrick Berglund. My picks are Jonathan Taves, Nicholas Backstrom, Semyon Varlamov, Milan Lucic, Steve Mason, Jeff Petrie, James Reimer, Derek Brassard, Jonathan Bernier, and Artem Anisimov. That is a solid draft in which Erik Johnson, the number one pick, they got Erik Johnson. What? Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
And like, all right. I mean, I think to also explain this, like we didn't do it as much top. The number of times that just hanging out over the years that I've known John, that we've been like, hey, let's just pull up the 06 NHL Draft Wikipedia page and lament about who we could have had instead.
It's so well. The thing is, like, I don't lament the fact they didn't draft Brad Marchand. He's never even close to being the number one pick.
But number 71.
Even Jordan Stahl would have just felt like a huge upgrade, and like all those guys, and because all guys that are near the top, and like, yikes. But there's plenty of other drafts that are near and dear to our hearts for positive or negative reasons, and we'll get to those eventually.
Yeah.
But I think we've rambled on long enough about this one. Any final words before we sign off, other than telling people to follow the socials, subscribe?
Yeah, follow socials, subscribe. To us on Spotify. Leave us a comment, rate us.
Last I checked, we had a 5-star rating on Spotify, and granted, I at that point was the only person who had rated us on Spotify. But look, I'm being objective here. I think we knocked it out of the park.
I have to agree with you. I think and John and I are professionals, so if you have anything that you think would help us, or you think there's anything that you'd like to see us do differently, we're open to feedback, guys. I mean, this is a thing that we're just two guys that are kind of having fun with it, but we want you, if you are listening, to be involved with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think next time we'll definitely try to keep the sports varied, so probably try to do a baseball and a basketball before we loop back to one of these sports. And if you have an idea for a draft that's not a complete redraft, but like, hey, I want you to draft the best this, we're open to anything at this point.
Yeah, there is the one drawback to this format is there's kind of like a finite number of drafts, and granted there are like hundreds of them. We intend to be here for the long haul, so if we're going to keep this podcast going for many, many years, we gotta. I think eventually we'll do like redrafts of redrafts. That'll be fun.
Yeah, or we'll start doing like XFL and MLS redrafts, and we'll just like start saying things where we're like, I don't know who this guy is, but the stats said he was okay.
Maybe like 100th draft, we draft our favorite episodes of Draft Day.
Dude, what if we draft like quotes from the movie Draft Day?
I was gonna say, what if we redrafted the movie Draft Day? Like,
oh my gosh!
Like, are you drafting the Chadwick Boseman guy? Or are you drafting Bo Callahan, who for some reason I remember the name of the quarterback that they were considering drafting throughout that movie, but can't remember Chadwick Boseman's character's name.
Bo Callahan, he lied, John. He didn't read the playbook.
That's true. And also he was 25 years old, according to one of the stills from that movie, because it is a... Look, I have affection for that movie, but it sucks. It's a bad movie. Let's be very clear.
I remember being so hyped when it came out because that was like at the height of my like... I love playing like the GM mode, and whether it was Madden or like being the coach and doing all the recruiting in NCAA football games and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then seeing that and just being like, oh, it's a movie about a guy who's just going to go against everything that everyone else on his team is telling him to do. Okay. So.
Yeah. And for the second episode of this in a row, I'd like to remind everybody that a central part of the plot of Draft Day is that the character portrayed by Kevin Costner has impregnated the character portrayed by Jennifer Garner, who is his employee. And for some reason, they don't both immediately get fired at the... That's an amazing twist at the end of the movie whenever he like tells people that she's pregnant, and it's like, oh, you're both fired immediately because you cannot be doing that if you're not disclosing that through HR at least. We should do like a series of podcasts about Draft Day. I will watch.
We have to do like a rewatch thing of it sometime, right?
I will watch and complain about that movie all day. It is a deeply insane movie.
I mean, if you guys want us to complain about the movie Draft Day, we will gladly do that for you. But all right, well, if nothing else, like you said, we've rambled. It's late as we're recording this, and I'm old, and we still have jobs. So until then, thanks for listening. Give us a follow on the socials, and we will see you guys next time.
Bye, everybody.